All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Iraq's prime minister supports an open ended U.S. troop presence. So, Iraq's new prime minister told the Wall Street Journal in an interview that was published on Sunday that he supports a continued U.S. troop presence in Iraq, breaking the silence on the issue since he came into office in October 2022. So, he's only been in office for a few months. This is Prime Minister Mohammed al Sudani, and these are his first public comments on the U.S. troop presence. And he said that he thinks they need these foreign forces. The U.S. currently has about 2,500 troops in Iraq. There's also some other troops from other NATO countries. I'm not sure the exact number of them, maybe just a few hundred. But this presence is a very divisive issue in Iraqi politics. According to the Wall Street Journal, al Sudani's supporters, and as well as the Iraqi Shia factions and the Shia militias, have pressed him to reconsider the stationing of U.S. forces in the country. A lot of them want the U.S. to leave. And American troops are in the country to train government forces against ISIS and to help them fight against ISIS. But in recent years, the U.S. has been at odds and has ended up in conflict with Iraq's Shia militias that it once allied with to fight against ISIS. Tensions really came to a head, of course, back in January 2020 when the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general. That drone strike also killed Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was the leader of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces. So he was an Iraqi. And the PMF is a group of mostly Shia militias. They're state-sponsored. They were formed in 2014 to fight ISIS, and the U.S. was allied with this group, when it launched its major war against ISIS. And the drone strike, of course, it enraged many in Iraq, and Iraq's parliament voted way back in January 2020 to expel U.S. forces. But the U.S. is still there. So Iraq's former prime minister, who just got out of office, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, he came in May 2020, so a few months after the Soleimani killing. He was under a lot of pressure to get the U.S. to leave. And this led to this kind of fake deal that he made with the U.S., which formally ended the combat mission in Iraq, and they changed it to an advisory role. The U.S. presence is only advisory now, but it didn't really change anything. The number of U.S. troops remained the same, 2,500, and the U.S. is still involved in combat operations in Iraq against ISIS. And so it was just a symbolic thing. And a major reason why that the U.S. really doesn't want to leave Iraq is because their presence in Iraq supports the occupation of eastern Syria, where there are about 1,000 U.S. troops, and the U.S. backs the Kurdish-led SDF over there. But that, again, against ISIS, but really that presence is also part of the economic war against Damascus. As I always talk about, the U.S. has Syria under these brutal sanctions with the purpose of preventing reconstruction. Those are Antony Blinken's words, not mine. Sudani, he said in this interview with the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. presence in Iraq is necessary to support U.S. forces in Syria. And he said it was needed to prevent a resurgence of ISIS in Syria. Although, if the U.S. pulls out of Syria, the Syrian government is a sworn enemy of ISIS, and they would work with their allies, Iran and Russia, to keep ISIS out of there. And the SDF has said that they're willing to work with Assad if the U.S. leaves, so they could all work together against ISIS. The U.S. presence isn't necessary. But Sudani, just a little background on him. He was voted into office by Iraq's parliament after a year-long political standoff between Muqtada al-Sadr, who is the influential Shia cleric who is not pro-Iran or pro-U.S. He very much wants an independent Iraq, and his political party won the elections in October 2021, so over a year ago, but they failed to form a government. He didn't want to work with the other Shia groups that are aligned with Iran, and the tensions culminated into very violent clashes in Baghdad that took place over the summer. Few people were killed. And this is, the democracy that the U.S. created after they invaded. But Sadr is interesting because he's not aligned with the U.S. or Iran, But Soudani is saying that, oh, we could have good ties with both the U.S. and Iran. So we'll see uh, how that goes. But the bottom line here is that as long as the U.S. remains in Iraq and remains in Syria, it risks sparking a wider war with these Shia militias and possibly Iran. U.S. bases in the two countries frequently come under rocket attack, and there hasn't been many casualties in these recent attacks, but the U.S. has previously really escalated. In one instance, in August 2022, a drone attack hit a base housing U.S. troops. No casualties, no injuries, nothing, no damage, they said. And the U.S. responded by launching airstrikes against what's actually an Afghan Shia group in Syria, killed a few of them. And they can never prove who are behind these attacks. So you can't just take the U.S.'s word for it. We know that. So just as long as this presence in both Iraq and Syria, because they're very connected, continue, something like what happened back in January 2020, it's always possible things could really escalate and ramp up like that. But unfortunately, it looks like no end in sight to the U.S. troop presence in Iraq after all these years. All right, the next article here, Ukraine's defense minister says that it's a fact that Kiev is a de facto NATO member. So this is Oleksiy Reznikov, the Ukrainian defense minister. He told BBC on Friday that Ukraine is a de facto NATO member because it's equipped with so many of the alliance's weapons. And he also dismissed the idea that what he's saying is controversial. So Reznikov said he was confident that Ukraine's Western backers would supply Kiev with warplanes and tanks, despite some concerns about escalating the war. So he said this on Friday. It looks like he's right because a day later, Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, confirmed that he's going to be sending tanks to Ukraine. We'll get more into that in the next article. But I'm going to read this quote from Reznikov to the BBC. He said, quote, "This concern about the next level of escalation for me is some kind of protocol. Ukraine as a country and the armed forces of Ukraine became the member of NATO, de facto, not de jure, which means not by law, because we have weaponry and the understanding of how to use it," end quote. So if you remember last week, Reznikov made similar comments when he was, it was in an interview on Ukrainian TV. And he said that Ukraine is shedding blood for a NATO mission. And Reznikov's views align with Russia, with Russian officials who have repeatedly stated that they are not just fighting a war against Ukraine, but also against the U.S. and NATO. And it was interesting, I thought, how he dismissed this, that what he was saying was controversial. He's just saying, of course, it's what I'm saying is true. And I have to agree with him. By getting all this NATO weaponry, they have become a de facto NATO member. And he's confident that they will join officially. He said, quote, "Why would it be controversial? It's true. It's a fact. I'm sure that in the near future we'll become a member of NATO de jure," end quote. So the implication that NATO is directly involved in the war, of course, gives Russia a pretext to launch an attack on NATO bases in Europe if it chooses to take that step. I've said this a lot. They have the pretext. Right now, there's no sign that Moscow is looking to take that step, but as the U.S. and its NATO allies continue to ramp up military aid, further escalation becomes much more likely. And speaking of escalation, the next one here, Sunak confirms that the British will be sending tanks to Ukraine. So I know this is probably confusing. I've been talking about tanks a lot. And we pretty much knew that the British were sending their tanks, but it's official now. The British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, on Saturday, he pledged in a call with Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, that London will provide Kiev with its main battle tank, the Challenger 2. So this could be the first Western-made heavy tank that Ukraine receives. Now we know Poland has said it's ready to send German-made Leopard 2 tanks to Kiev, but it's not clear when that's going to happen. It's not clear if they've really begun the process of doing it or they're just talking about it. And they do have to formally ask Berlin for permission. Germany's vice chancellor said they wouldn't get in the way. But again, the ball's not really rolling there. So I think these Challenger 2 tanks are going to get there probably first. And the UK is set to send 14 of these tanks, which is far short, of course, of the 300 that Ukrainian officials say they need. Poland has said that it's willing to send a similar number, but they're hoping more countries do so. They want to do it as part of an international coalition. So we'll see how that all shakes out. And of course, this is an escalation of military aid. It risks provoking Russia. Scholz, the German chancellor, he previously said he was trying to avoid a direct clash between NATO and Russia when explaining his opposition to sending tanks. But this is all, those concerns seem to be going away. And in response to Sunak's pledge, the Russian embassy in London said that such support would only prolong the war. They're saying it would just drag things out and intensify combat. Speaking of intensifying combat, the next article here, Russia launches a new round of missile strikes across Ukraine. So this was on Saturday. Russian missile strikes hit Ukrainian infrastructure targets, energy infrastructure in several regions across Kiev. And this was the first time in about 2 weeks that they did this. For a while, they were really pounding the infrastructure. There was a 2-week lull. And a Russian missile also hit an apartment building in the central city of Dnipro. And according to Ukrainian authorities, dozens of civilians were killed. The Russian Defense Ministry said that all designated targets were hit in their missile barrage. They didn't comment on the reports of this apartment building being struck. Moscow, they always say that they don't target civilians, but their attacks on infrastructure have left millions of Ukrainian civilians without power. So what was interesting, Alexei Arestovich, who's an advisor to Zelensky, he suggested in an interview that he did on YouTube with some former Russian guy, he said that the missile that hit the apartment building, it may have fallen after it was intercepted by Ukrainian air defenses. So he's saying, I guess they shot it out of the sky and it fell on this apartment building. And Russian media, picked up his comments. It was all over Russian media, I saw, and he faced criticism inside of Ukraine. And apparently responding to this criticism, he wrote on Telegram that even if this was true, what he said, that it was a Ukrainian air defense missile that shot this Russian missile down into the apartment building, he said nobody's going to blame Ukraine because everybody would understand that this wouldn't have happened if Russia wasn't bombing Ukraine. And an example of this, he pointed to the Ukrainian S-300 air defense missile that hit Poland back in November. That killed 2 civilians. And Western officials didn't put much blame on Ukraine for the incident, even though, they weren't happy because at the time, Zelensky, even though he must have known that it was a Ukrainian missile, portrayed it as a deliberate Russian attack and asked for direct NATO intervention in response. So, we don't really know what exactly happened with this apartment building. Either way, it's horrific. It looks like a lot of civilians were killed. Zelensky's saying the death toll rose to 30 on Sunday. But it's interesting that this guy said that, and then you see the pushback inside Ukraine, and we know the Zelensky government has tight control of the media, so it's tough to really know what's coming out. And with this conflict, both sides, you just kind of have to. It's hard to know what's really going on. But it's interesting that he said that, and Zelensky in his nightly address, he vowed revenge and all that for this strike. But I want to take this moment to mention again that it's our fundraiser. It's still going on. I know, it's been tough these past few months. In our previous fundraiser as well, trying to raise money. We know things are a little tight for people, but if you like antiwar.com, if you like my coverage, if you appreciate this show, this is how we get by. It's what we have to do to provide this type of coverage from our viewpoint. And really, just kind of what I do pretty much all day is trudge through, hundreds of news articles and figure out what's what to the best of my ability. And I don't always get everything right. It's hard. I get a lot of help, of course, from people I work with and readers and friends. But it's a full-time job. I do this. I work about 12 hours a day, to do this. And, I don't, we don't make that much money, and your donation is basically just paying the staff. We put a lot of output. We have a lot of output for the money that we get. So none of it's being wasted. And we still have the short letter on the top of the page from John Mearsheimer endorsing antiwar.com. Again, just such an important voice. So if he says you should support us, you should support us. So go to antiwar.com/donate for that. All right, let's get back into the news. The next one here, the Israeli army chief, the outgoing Israeli army chief, says that Israel has three plans to attack Iran. So this is Aviv Kohavi. He's the outgoing head of the Israeli Defense Forces. He warned Friday that Israel has three operational plans drawn up to attack Iran. In an interview on Friday, he said that Israel drew up these plans to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear bomb. Although I always have to point out that the Pentagon recently admitted Iran is currently not building a nuclear weapon. So, according to Israel's I-24 News, he said he made a claim that is just completely untrue. He said that Iran currently has enough enriched uranium to develop four nuclear bombs, but this is completely false because Iran has no uranium enriched at the 90% level needed for weapons grade. And any other uranium enriched below that, it can't make a bomb. And their highest level of enrichment is currently at 60%, and that's only some of it. Most of it is at 20 or lower. So maybe what he's saying is the amount of enriched uranium that they have, if it was weapons grade, it was enough to make four bombs. But, this is typical stuff that you hear from Israeli officials about this issue. And he outlined plans that the IDF had for potential strikes. He said, I'll just read his quote. He said, quote, "These extend from a retaliatory strike on Iran that would be unrelated to the nuclear issue to the taking out of the Iranian nuclear installations and auxiliary sites in that project. And if the situation eventually escalates into a full-fledged campaign, then these plans also include the targeting of military sites and other assets," end quote. So Kahavi, he has spent much of his time as the head of the IDF working on accelerating plans to strike Iran. That's how he always puts it. Although it's not clear if Israel could really pull off airstrikes in Iran without support from the U.S. In November, he traveled to Washington, D.C., and received commitments from the U.S. that they would step up military cooperation. And following his trip, the U.S. and Israel simulated bombing Iran during drills over the Mediterranean Sea. Such cooperation is expected to continue as the new Israeli government under Netanyahu is likely to ramp up Israel's hawkish policies against Iran, and the U.S. has no intention of reviving the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. So Kohavi, he's out. He's going to be replaced on Monday by Herzi Halevi, who is his deputy right now. And on his way out, he also criticized the new government, the coalition agreement. They took some powers away from the military and gave it to civilian ministers over the West Bank. All right, the next one, Netanyahu defiant despite protests against Israel judicial reform. So there were huge protests against Netanyahu in Tel Aviv over the weekend. About 80,000 people attended. And it's basically, he has this plan to overhaul the judiciary system. And how I understand it, I haven't read too much into this, but basically his government is going to give the legislatures, the Knesset, more power over the legal system. They'll be able to kind of override Israel's top court. And people are very upset about it, but he's saying, no, most people actually support it. Forget all them. We're going to do it. Even though the country's attorney general has really spoken out. I mean, people are very angry about this. It's not just the people on the streets. It's a lot of Israeli officials. But Netanyahu's saying that he's going to do it anyway. So, all right, the next one. The Biden administration is preparing to sell F-16s to Turkey, and Bob Menendez is not happy about it. So this is Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey. He's the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so he's very influential when it comes to foreign policy decisions. And he's come out pretty strongly against a potential F-16 sale to Turkey. That was reported by the Wall Street Journal on Friday. The report said that the Biden administration is preparing to notify Congress of a major arms deal for Turkey and Greece, two NATO allies that have been at odds over territorial disputes in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. I haven't followed that too closely either. The Turkey-Greece tensions, Erdogan was, threatening that their missiles can reach Greece recently. But anyway, so the deal is for Greece to get 30 F-35 fighter jets, and that's likely not going to face any opposition from Congress. They don't have any problems with the Greeks. But the sale for Turkey would be for 40 F-16 fighter jets and 79 kits to upgrade their existing fleet. It may face stiff resistance in Congress. Many lawmakers are not happy with Ankara for several reasons, including Turkey withholding its approval of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. So this was interesting. U.S. officials told the Journal that they are trying to convince Turkey to approve the NATO bid, Sweden and Finland's NATO bid. And one official called the F-16 sale a carrot on a stick. So this is how they bribe countries to do things. They offer them huge weapons deals. The official said that Turkey's approval would lead to less opposition in Congress over the deal, which is probably true. But Menendez, he kind of singled out, human rights abuses carried out by the Erdogan government as his issue. These alleged rights abuses, and that's pretty much what he focused on. He didn't really mention the NATO issue. So he said, quote, President Erdogan continues to undermine international law, disregard human rights and democratic norms, and engage in alarming and destabilizing behavior in Turkey and against neighboring NATO allies. Until Erdogan ceases his threats, improves this human rights record at home, including by releasing journalists and political opposition, and begins to act like a trusted ally, I will not approve this sale, end quote. So basically, it seems like he's setting up for a fight between Congress and the administration over this. I'm sure most Republicans are going to approve this deal. Actually, no, that's not true. Again, with the NATO thing, I think that's the big thing here. So they might really try to leverage this deal with the NATO bid. But Turkey's foreign minister is visiting the U.S. this week, and he's due to arrive on Tuesday in Washington, D.C., and that's when the Biden administration is expected to notify Congress of this sale. So when they notify Congress, it begins a period where Congress can block it if they want. But, they need the support. They need a majority to want to block it. All right, the next one, more about Turkey. Turkey says that it's unlikely to approve Sweden and Finland's NATO bids before June. So this was a spokesman for Erdogan, Ibrahim Kalin. He said that Sweden needs time before it can codify new counterterrorism measures into law. So this is Sweden's changing their constitution, their laws, to make Turkey satisfied enough to approve their NATO membership. And they say it needs time. He says it may take up to 6 months until June. And Turkey's main issue with Sweden and Finland is their alleged support for the PKK, Kurdish militant group that Turkey, as well as the U.S. and the EU, consider a terrorist organization. Turkey's also looking for a lot of extraditions from Sweden, but they approved one so far of a Kurdish man who went to Sweden for asylum. But Sweden's Supreme Court has denied some other extraditions. So again, it's just not really clear if they're going to approve it. This is also very much about the fact that Turkey's next presidential election is coming up pretty soon, and this guy, Erdogan's spokesman, said that that kind of is the issue as well. He said, quote, given the fact that the president will have to send this bill to the parliament to ratify it, lawmakers will have to be convinced. To be honest with you, we will not be in a position to have this passed just like that from the parliament. We don't have the numbers. The opposition will ask all kinds of questions, and we cannot risk our political capital as we go into elections in the next 3 or 4 months, end quote. So saying it pretty much outright that it's related to the elections. And, he might be right that they don't have the support because it is Turkey's parliament that has to approve this, not just the government. So who knows? This is all very iffy still. And I think that they will eventually sign off on it, but they're going to try to get a lot of stuff out of the U.S., like some new F-16s. All right, the last story in the news section, the U.S. will increase its military presence in Micronesia. Just what everybody is hoping for, right? So the U.S. and the Federated States of Micronesia, which is a Pacific island nation, they're nearing a deal that would give more economic aid to Micronesia in exchange for more U.S. military access to the islands. And this is according to The Federated States of Micronesia President David Panulo, if I pronounced that right, he said this on Friday. So it's kind of an interesting arrangement that the U.S. has with Micronesia and the Marshall Islands as well, and Palau, these Pacific island nations, part of Oceania. Um, this deal would be an extension of these agreements that are known as the Compact of Free Association. Under these deals, the Pacific countries are treated similarly to U.S. territories. They receive economic assistance and other support and services from the U.S., and they fall under protection of the U.S. military in exchange for allowing U.S. forces to operate in these countries. And the U.S. is allowed to deny other foreign militaries access to these nations. And extending these agreements and other U.S. military expansion planned for the region is viewed in Washington as vital to the U.S. plans against China. This is all about China. So the president, he said that these negotiations with the U.S. are almost done, and under this new deal, his country will receive $140 million in annual grants from the U.S. This is an increase of $50 million from current levels. He said residents should expect an increase in U.S. military activity over the next few years. He said, quote, "These exercises will be increasing in frequency over the next several years, and while they are ultimately in our national interest and in the interest of our nation's security, of which the U.S. is our indisputable guardian, it is important that our citizens know about them well in advance so that our people do not see these activities and then immediately fear the worst," end quote. So he said that it would be important to inform people when U.S. fighter jets are going to be flying around and when they're going to be firing anti-aircraft missiles from the ground. I mean, that would be pretty unsettling things to see if you're not aware of it, considering how loud jets are and all that. So the U.S. is also nearing deals with the Marshall Islands and Palau on extending their compact free association agreements. The Associated Press reported on Saturday that the U.S. has already signed memorandums of understanding with the Marshall Islands and Palau, and that a final deal is coming soon. So when it comes to Palau, they're pretty eager. They want a new U.S. military base. The U.S. has begun construction on a big radar system there. And again, this is all about China. The U.S. expansion, really trying to increase their military footprint in this region. So it's an area to keep an eye on. And when it comes to the Marshall Islands, I didn't get into it in this article, but I'll have an opportunity to soon, I'm sure. The U.S. has a very dark history in the Marshall Islands. In the 1950s and the 1960s, they carried out dozens of nuclear tests. And the Bikini Atoll is kind of the most notorious one. And they destroyed it. And in some of these places, they let people go back there, even though they knew radiation levels were super high, and the environmental damage is still being felt today. And there's birth defects, and a lot of people died and got cancer because of it. And the Marshall Islands want more compensation than what the U.S. has given them. So that could be part of the deal that they get. So anyway, it's just an area of the world that a lot of people don't know how involved the U.S. is in these small islands just out there in the middle of the ocean. But that's it for the news. So it's MLK Day, so we have a lot of viewpoints about that. We have one from Rick Sterling about his famous speech Beyond Vietnam that Martin Luther King Jr. gave in April 1967, and he compares it. Basically, the speech was about his opposition to Vietnam and a little history about how the U.S. supported the French in Vietnam before the U.S. really got as involved. And Sterling draws some comparisons to U.S. policy in Ukraine, how the U.S. has been involved there for a long time. One from William J. Astore, Imperial Dominance Disguised as Democratic Deterrence. That gets into the National Defense Strategy and things like that. William Hartung over at Responsible Statecraft. Martin Luther King's anti-war views are more relevant than ever. One from Fiona Harrigan over at Reason about a U.S. congressman who wants the U.S. to use military force against the military cartels. And this congressman is Mike Waltz from Florida. And then the spotlight is MLK's speech that we published a few years ago. We like to run it on MLK Day. Why he's opposed to the war in Vietnam from 1967. All right, but that's it. That was a lot of stuff today. Again, support us, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube. Share it around. Leave reviews. All that stuff. That's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow with a lot more news. Thanks for listening.